In 2019, I made a movie about a show of Pennsylvania Academy alumni. There was a drawing that just blew me away. It was done by Tom Mallon, a 71-year-old artist who now lives in Indiana. Tom's work is figurative, meticulously crafted and composed, and filled with profound ideas and emotions. When I got him on the phone a few weeks ago, I asked him how he became so interested in depicting the human form.
I was always fascinated by anatomy. On summer vacations when I was around 9, my friends and I would wander South Philadelphia streets. If it were hot, we'd stroll into these factories to drink cooled water from fountains. One day, I wandered into a slaughterhouse. There were many flayed cattle hanging from hooks. Towards the front, with their backs facing me, were these huge tireless workers in rubber aprons. They were all built like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Fascinated, I sat down on a bench to watch them. They worked at an incredible pace. They tossed cow parts into various barrels. After about 15 minutes, one of them noticed me sitting there and it said to me, "I don't think you should be here, kid." I said, "Why not? This is pretty cool." I remember he laughed. Then he started explaining the anatomy of the cow he was cutting up. He showed me how the limbs worked, as well as the placement of the major organs. He showed me how the skeleton operated like an armature that supports everything. As a kid, I was really into trains, and in that slaughterhouse, I realized that bodies are very much like machines. There's a mechanical logic to them. After returning 4 or 5 times, management finally got wind and I was banned. Perhaps they worried I'd grow up to be a serial killer.
Tom's figures don't happen to be just random nude people. Many, if not most, are characters from Greek and Roman mythology.
Shortly after that, Steve Reeves' Hercules movies arrived at our local movie house, the Earl Theater. For only $1.25, I could spend a day watching scenes of multiple figures fighting, fascinated by how their articulated bodies would work together visually. It's a theme that's still driving my figurative work today. During a summer course while in high school, I entered the Pennsylvania Academy's Rotunda. There I came upon Michelangelo's Dying Slave and the Belvedere torso. Man, I was hooked and immediately started drawing the Dying Slave. The Academy didn't have an anatomy class until my final year. However, through some friends, I managed to attend some dissections at Jefferson Medical College. But compared to the slaughterhouse, this was a huge disappointment. The livestock were fresh kills and their bodies were filled with differentiating color. By contrast, the cadavers at Jefferson had been drained of blood and treated. Consequently, everything was gray, so it was challenging to distinguish nerves from arteries as well as muscle groups. At PAFA, I gradually became adept at portraiture and figure painting, working from life, cast, and imagination. One large painting of mine won first prize at a show at the Philadelphia Civic Center, but Mayor Frank Rizzo personally had it removed from the exhibit, claiming the nudity would upset women and children. So, of course, I lost the prize money.
Regarding his disappointment over that prize money, I need to point out that Tom experienced true poverty during his art school years. He lived in a tenement with no heat. Fortunately, his girlfriend's mother pilfered food for him from the cafeteria where she worked. And Tom did win a whole bunch of other prizes from the Academy, including 2 traveling scholarships, which were by far the most coveted. Back in those days, the Academy offered a certificate, not a degree. But if you had the funds, you could get an Ivy League BFA.
In 2020 hindsight, I probably should have pursued a degree from the University of Pennsylvania and then gone on to Yale. I would have learned so much. But at that time, I was entirely on my own and had to turn a buck. I turned to illustration to earn a living. My first real gig was doing executive portraits each month during the first year of Inc. magazine. After that, I stumbled onto college textbook illustration. Over what would be a 12-year stretch, I would work on over 200 texts. A dozen or so I illustrated as a solo artist.
Tom was a pioneer of so-called pedagogical illustration. Tom, what the heck is that?
Well, before I started, all illustration in physics and math books looked schematical, flat, and the furthest thing from self-explanatory. See that woman pouring water? That was a new concept and was intuitive because it related to everyday occurrences that people could identify with. See that little chart with the trucks going downhill? That indicates the visual weight necessary for a student to grasp a cumulative inertia through gravity and momentum. Before I came along, those trucks and figures didn't exist. They would have been just curves with vector lines indicating direction. That particular physics book had over 1,000 illustrations and is still a success today as artwork remains in use across a series of different texts by the same author. One publisher asked, how would you go about making a genetics book more pedagogical? I replied by asking, you're doing a 4-color text, right? The answer was yes. Well, instead of a 1-color schematic, I will do all the different genetic strains in different colors. That genetics book was another surprise success. Not only was it the first one in color, but it was the very first where people could glance at a drawing and understand immediately what was going on. My wife was a dedicated mother and house manager. She did a great job with the kids, so it was up to me to provide. When illustration dried up, I got a job selling software, for which I had a very deep fascination. Sales were great. However, during this time, it became impossible for me to do any serious artwork. I got a job at Reuters America in a division known as MoneyNet.com, where I worked with really great programmers.
Tom and this group built the very first online trading application, earlier even than Microsoft Investor. For years, Tom went from one internet startup to another. He helped pioneer UX, or user experience design. Finally, he ended up at a Fortune 50 company
to manage content across 37 different commercial sites. I worked remotely after we moved to the Southwest to be closer to my wife's family. I retired in 2013. Only then was I able to resume art, which I personally wanted to create. I began with a series of paintings of historical landmarks of New Mexico. Then I spent a couple of years just drawing and working on composition. It's funny, but some of my best ideas come to me right before I fall asleep. It's not quite a dream state, yet I'm not fully awake either. It's sort of like a goodnight kiss.
I love how Tom creates images that are both so grounded in the reality of seen things and yet also so otherworldly. He told me about his drawing, Duopoly.
The two men facing each other in the same pose represent the two-party system. An uninvolved, preoccupied party member flanks each. The Rubik's Cube-like structure behind represents civilization, reliable and stable at the base, but corrupt and crumbling towards the top. There's also a little nest where a raven has stolen one of the eggs, representing the stolen future of future generations, one threatened by environmental degradation, food shortages, and overpopulation. The fissure on the ground represents how the human government has separated itself from the earth. The airplane and the shield symbolize perpetual war. A mandrill and its cub atop closed books is a comment on the decline of education. The pile of coins represents the money driving politics and the war machine. The snake, corruption. In the background, an oil field indicates the CO2 industry is alive and well, while the ominous clouds represent ongoing climate change.
Tom has a great interest in and knowledge of art history. He told me that he based the design of Duopoly on Da Vinci's Madonna of the Rocks.
For me, composition is king.
Back in the early 1970s, PAFA's Ben Kamahira spoke admiringly and perhaps even with a little jealousy of Tom's natural gift for composition.
It was easier then. Now I struggle because I lean towards the complex. The more complex, the better? Perhaps, provided everything works.
It took me a long time to persuade Tom to let me make a movie about him. You should be making movies about artists who need promotion to sell their work, he told me. There is an irony there, because Tom himself has never had great luck selling his fine art. No, I told him. What artists really need is examples of how you can keep your art life going despite the enormous hurdles in your way. He thought about that for a little while, and thankfully, he agreed. As I was editing his audio, I called Tom to tell him that he was one of those rare but wondrous artists who have what I call the voice. Not just how he sounds, but the way he expresses himself makes him immensely likable and compelling. Humble as always, Tom replied, "Gee, I'm really looking forward to meeting that Tom Mallon." To learn more about that Tom Mallon, go to tmallon.com. In addition to making art, Tom has written a number of essays, some of which you can access from his About page. I want especially to thank two pianists for the terrific music in this video. The Brahms pieces were played by Paul Cantrell, and the Schumann ones by Donald Betts. Thank you.